Good evening, everybody. Today is Monday, April 21st, 7 p.m. in Tokyo. We are extremely happy to have our honored speaker tonight, Professor Hisaaki Yamanouchi. He often gives us he's the last speaker usually at the end of the Q&A, consistently gives us such erudite comments that I asked him to be a speaker. And so tonight, instead of finishing, he will be our speaker. Okay, someone else will have to be the last one. All right, I'm conducting the PowerPoint presentation in full screen on my own screen here, and we'll just see how this goes. All right, let me, it's not paying attention to me. I'm going to share the screen. Share. Can everybody see that first slide with the blue title?
Yes.
All right, wonderful.
Fine. Yes.
Okay, with that, and if there's any problems, let me know, but let's get rolling. I'd like briefly to say that Yamanouchi Sensei is everybody, please mute yourself. He is a professor emeritus of English from Tokyo University. He was born in Hiroshima in 1934 and studied at Tokyo, Columbia, and Cambridge universities. He was the first Japanese to receive a PhD in English from Cambridge. He's taught at a number of universities and has quite a publications list. I have shared the rest of this information and it will also be in the upcoming report. Okay, with that, if I may, Yamanouchi Sensei, the floor is yours. When you want me to change a slide, just say next.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for your introduction. I would like to start by thanking you for letting me take part in Informasia and for this opportunity to speak to you. My subject today is the English poet Anthony Thwaite. How could I dare to speak to you about English poetry when there are professional practicing poets among you like Tim Harris, Paul Rosita, and others? A 90-year-old retired recluse, I lead these days a life of reticence, hardly speaking in public, let alone in English. I humbly beg for your tolerance as well as patience. At the same time, I have to justify the choice of my subject. Who is Anthony Thwaite, and why am I talking about him? He was born on the 23rd of June 1930 and died on the 22nd of April 2021. Today is one day before the 4th anniversary of his death. Soon after he died, Andrew Motion wrote a commemorative poem a day earlier, by which he meant that Thwaite died a day earlier than Shakespeare, who died on the 23rd of April. Who is Anthony Thwaite may as well be answered by quoting from one or another of his obituaries. Please allow me to pick out from the Independent. Anthony Thwaite, who has died aged 90, was a poet and an editor who was deeply engaged with English literary life throughout his long and prolific career. Although perhaps now best known for his work on his friend Philip Larkin's collected poems and letters, Thwaite's own poetry is remarkable for achieving such clarity of thought and idea, which the poet Vernon Scannell described as unflashy, honest, scrupulously chiseled. Thwaite's twin passions for poetry and for archaeology emerged early on in life. Born in Chester in 1930, he was given a Roman silver denarius for his 7th birthday by a favorite uncle. When evacuated to his aunt's home near Washington, D.C., escaping wartime Britain, Thwaite would delight in digging in Civil War trenches for musket balls left behind by Confederate soldiers. National service took him to Libya in 1950, where he found himself stationed just a mile away from the site of Leptis Magna, the great Roman city and hometown of the Emperor Septimius Severus. He spoke later of this time as a huge inspiration to me, both as an aspirant archaeologist and as an aspirant poet. I spent hours and hours walking through it, foraging in it, usually by myself. Following demobilization, Thwaite read English at Oxford, where he edited the weekly magazine Isis and became president of the Poetry Society. His first anthology of poems was published by Oscar Miller's Fantasy Press in 1953, propelling him to recognition alongside poets such as Tom Gunn, Elizabeth Jennings, and Philip Larkin. It was whilst at Oxford that he met Anne Harrop, whom he married in 1955. Thwaite had spent 2 years teaching in Tokyo during the mid-50s. He later published Letter from Tokyo 1987, based on an extended stay during the mid-80s, as well as editing the Penguin Book of Japanese Verse. Thwaite joined the BBC Overseas Service and in 1958 met and befriended Larkin. Larkin's collected poems, edited by Thwaite, was published in 1988. It was followed by selected letters and letters to Monica. Thwaite's own favorite, and some would say most successful work, Victorian Voices, was influenced by his wife Anne's biographical research on Edmund Gosse, titled Edmund Gosse, A Literary Landscape. These 2 publications remain testament to the couple's creative partnership. He had been a literary editor of both The Listener and The New Statesman. In 1986, as chairman of the Booker Prize judges, he read all 128 volumes submitted that year. Thwaite was awarded 2 honorary doctorates from Hull and East Anglia. He was a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and was awarded an OBE 1990 for services to poetry. Thwaite is survived by his wife Anne and by his daughters. The Independent obituary gives a gist of Thwaite's life and work, which I would like to supplement with chronology and biography. My earlier slides on the PowerPoint. With 4 years difference in age, Thwaite and I belong to the same generation. We were too young to know World War II in the battlefield, but old enough to know it elsewhere. The poem, September the 3rd, 1939, Bournemouth, is about the outbreak of the war when Thwaite was 9. Evacuation, 1940, reproduces the scene in which Thwaite sets out from Liverpool for America, seen off by his parents, and Maturity, 1944, the scene in which he comes home grown and is met by his parents. One other poem, Snakes, Virginia, 1940, is about how the poet, as a boy, was engrossed in the wild nature of the New World, with hardly any hint that the war was going on. As for me, when it broke out, I was in the first year of primary school in Hiroshima. There, mass evacuation, collective evacuation did not start till March 1945. I did not join it and was rebuked by my schoolmaster as uncooperative and unpatriotic. I was the youngest and spoiled child of my parents. Staying away in a village to the north of Hiroshima, my mother and I survived the bomb. I regret I have no poem of mine to show you about war. On coming home from America, Thwaite resumed his English education at Kingswood School, a boarding school then in Bath. While he was there, his uncommon poetic gift was recognized in what he wrote on the model of Anglo-Saxon riddles by his master, Mr. W.G. Ingram, known as the co-editor of Shakespeare's Messian edition of Shakespeare's sonnets. We must thank Mr. Ingram, who encouraged Thwaite to write poetry and to be a poet. He was then admitted to Christ Church, Oxford as English scholar. By picking out from the Independent obituary, I have already referred to the publication of his poems in the Isis and by Fantasy Press, and his activity as president of the Oxford Poetry Society. The Oxford School of English, it was then at one of its heydays, where Lord David Cecil, C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, Helen Gardner, and others were lecturing. In 1955, the ambition of the 25-year-old Anthony Thwaite was to be an active poet at home when he noticed the British Council advertisement for the post of teaching English language and literature at Tokyo University. By coming to Japan, he might be sidetracked from the course already laid out for him, but he had the bent to look towards other cultures. He had already had his military service in Libya, where he was later to go back as assistant professor of English literature at the University of Libya in Benghazi. The Roman sites which he had encountered in Leptis Magna stood for the legacy of Western civilization of which he was a part. In Japan, he would be seeing something of the other hemisphere. He knew of his distinguished predecessors who had come to the East, such as I.A. Richards, William Empson, Ralph Hodgson, and above all, Edmund Blunden. It happened that Professor Takeshi Saito, the founding father of English studies at Tokyo University, a good friend of Blunden's as well as of Siegfried Sassoon's, was visiting Oxford and was invited to attend a meeting of the Oxford Poetry Society, of which Thwaite was the president and Anne Harrop, his wife-to-be, was the secretary. The encounter between the venerable old professor and the ambitious young poet clicked, driving the latter to decide to go to Japan, which was to lead to fruitful cultural exchange for decades to come. Having arranged for the BBC to reserve for 2 years his contract as student trainee, Anthony and the newly married Anne Thwaite set out for Japan, arriving in September 1955. At Tokyo University, there are two departments for English studies. The Department of English Language and Literature in the Faculty of Letters at Hongo, which has existed since the 19th century, producing a number of scholars, writers, etc., including Natsume Soseki, and the Department of British Studies, newly founded in 1955 at Komaba, where I was reared as undergraduate. While the one concentrates on the traditional study of English literature, the latter aims at interdisciplinary study of British culture and society, including literature. I do not know to what extent the situation had been explained before Thwaite came to Japan. He held his official full-time post at Komaba, but it would have been a waste of talent if he had not taught at Hongo. It was rightly arranged for him to teach the undergraduates once a week at Hongo as well, and to have an extracurricular meetings with the graduate students, including the late Yasunari Takahashi, whom he labeled with respect the rising generation of English studies in Japan. In retrospect, I cannot but admit that there was a gap between the reality of British studies in terms of its system and students and what he had expected of it. With his sense of mission, he began giving lectures of high standards, as he had known at Oxford, to the mixed audience who were not necessarily interested in literature, but were eager never to miss the opportunity to hear this brilliant young poet lecturer. Thwaite was somewhat disappointed at the students' response, but it was compensated for by the presence of one Hide Ishiguro, then a student of French studies and a future philosopher known widely to the world. A series of lectures he gave to us was on 20th century poetry, soon to be published as Essays on Contemporary English Poetry, Hopkins to the Present Day. This is slide 6, frequently reprinted later in Britain. In another, he taught John Donne and metaphysical poets, in which I detected the shadows of Helen Gardiner, whom he had heard lecture at Oxford. I was among the fortunate who were taught by him. He was my first ever British mentor, once a mentor, always a mentor, who inspired and initiated me into English studies. Before I met him, I had had the preconception that poets were, as a French symbolist, for instance, dissident, antisocial, and even decadent for the sake of their sacred realm of creativity. I said to myself, look, here's a poet who is sane and healthy, so positive to life, yet so creative. So he was, and never changed to the end of his life. That was Anthony Thwaite. You will see from the select bibliography slides 8 and 9 on Thwaite published 20 or so individual volumes of poems to be collected into one volume, collected poems, published in 2007, slide 34. Sorry, it's a wider part. When Thwaite started writing poetry in the post-war literary climate, most actively writing poets were grouped under the name of movement. Among them, Philip Larkin was most notable. Critics often talk of Larkin's influence on Thwaite. He was certainly conscious of Larkin and admired him, as in fact he made friends with him, was later to edit his collected poems and selected letters, and even to become his literary co-executor. But it is more correct to say that Thwaite found and developed his own poetic style. One difference in their life is that Larkin dislikes traveling abroad, whereas Thwaite traveled widely, coming to Japan at least 10 times, even 11 times, and many other countries. Thwaite's poetry is quite varied in theme and style, and very wide in scope. One of the possible ways of coming to grips with some characteristic features of his poetry would be to read his own favorite poems. They are recorded by Poetry Archive. I didn't consult with Patricia whether it might be possible to reproduce his reading from Poetry Archive or not. Probably not.
We can include the link in the report.
Ah, I see, but not now.
Well, if you wanted to just play maybe, I don't know, 30 seconds of it just to give a flavor, is that possible?
Monologue in the Valley of the Kings. That is his favorite, if possible. Sorry, I sound very demanding.
What slide is that?
Sorry, it's not on the slide, so I give it up.
Okay.
It's some external source, I'm
All right.
afraid. Well, Thwaite makes revealing remarks in his conversation with Peter Dale and Ian Hamilton. Oh, if you were granted a wish that one of your poems could survive, which would it be? I think you might be surprised, but I would have to say Monologue in the Valley of the Kings. The text of the poem is on slides 22 and 23, although the print is too small. Can it be legible?
Not sure, but
Thank
I've got it on. I've got it up. Go
This is
ahead.
it.
Okay, so I'm showing slide with the monologue in the Valley of the King.
I'll try my very personal comment on the poem. And, many of you will disagree, and please correct me. In 1967, Thwaite first visited the Valley of Kings, where he saw the tomb of Tutankhamun and was deeply impressed. Several years later, he had an opportunity to see the collections at the Egyptian section of the British Museum, which revoked his memories and led to the composition of this poem. The poem is set in the Valley of the Kings and consists of the dead pharaoh's monologue to the living archaeologist doing research into the tomb. It is characteristically written with a method of dramatic monologue, of which Browning was the originator, and Thwaite himself proved to be a master in his Victorian voices. The whole poem entirely consists of the monologue by the mummied pharaoh, who dominates the living archaeologist. The pharaoh's extended description of the decorative interiors of the tomb draws the reader's attention and sustains it. In the meantime, the archaeologist is kept inferior and subordinate. His ultimate purpose is to find the mummied pharaoh hidden in a chamber, but the chamber is tucked away deceptively beyond a blind alley and levered by a granite. What is more, the key is hidden in the pharaoh's skull. That means it is inaccessible from the beginning. You will never find it, the pharaoh repeats to the archaeologist like a refrain. In this situation, the reader is put in an advantageous position to know, while the archaeologist is kept ignorant of the fact. With a sequence of monologue, the pharaoh is superior to the archaeologist, the dead to the living, the past to the present. Never able to fulfill the aim of his research, the archaeologist is put to humiliation. The pharaoh ironically jokes about having their imaginary conversation after the archaeologist's death. Why is this poem Thwaite's own favorite? Thwaite's twin aspirations, archaeology and poetry, are perfectly united in this poem by way of dramatic monologue. The dead pharaoh's mummy from the past talking to the archaeologist living in the present. Common to the parallel aspirations is to know not only the pastness of the past, but its presentness. This is revealed through both archaeology and poetry. What will come out of all this? Readers of Thwaite's poems know that his lifetime archaeological interest was first evoked by the Roman silver denarius given by a favorite uncle on his 7th birthday. It was further developed by his finding buried musket balls in the trenches of the Confederate soldiers in the Civil War, while he was evacuated in America during World War II. And it finally reached its climax when he encountered the ruined Roman site near Leptis Magna while he was in military service in Libya. What does archaeology mean to him? It involves a two-way process of the present speaking to the past and the past speaking back to the present. Through this process, one recognizes not only the pastness of the past, but also its presentness. In archaeology, a dialogue between the past and the present is made possible through material objects, while in poetry, through words. In a British Council pamphlet published in 1989, he characterized the process that goes into making poetry as essentially mysterious, but for him, summed up as both as a commemoration, a moment captured, and an excavation, the archaeologist monkey side of me, digging into something hidden and bringing it to light. It is interesting to compare this with Seamus Heaney, for whom agricultural digging into the soil of Ireland is equivalent to poetic digging into the words of poetry. In this poem, the status of the living archaeologist is lowered. The voice of the dead pharaoh is dominant. The archaeologist's research will never be achieved and will never be remembered. This might suggest the realistic, severe fact about the futility of any human attempt in the world against the permanence of the past, the dead, the immortal, and the eternal. While having aspirations on the one hand, do we, on the other, have to accept resignation about human achievement? In Thwaite's conception, the archaeologist's attempt to obtain the secret of the pharaoh is equivalent to the poet's attempt to capture the truth through words. We can sense that he is aware of various difficulties in writing poetry and is not entirely optimistic. But despite these difficulties, and instead of feeling futile, he is resolute to keep writing poetry. To the twin parallel between archaeology may be added pottery, which also involves an act of digging. Thus, all three constitute for Thwaite, forgive my sounding bombastic, if not blasphemous, the Holy Trinity for Thwaite. Pottery can be obtained from antiquarian digging. Thus, all archaeology, poetry, and pottery constitute the Holy Trinity for him. This has been my very personal, premature comment on the poem. In the next section, I would like to talk about the poem which I have never heard Thwaite read. The poem is Soseki, London, December 1901. There are two versions, 1901 and 1902. The original version was 1902. And at some point, I had a conversation with Anthony that Soseki was in London from 1900 and 1902. If the poem is about what is going on at the moment, it should be 1901. And if Soseki is recollecting towards the end of his stay in London, it could be to 1902. So the choice is the poet's. Thwaite shows an aspect of encounter between cultures by portraying Soseki in London facing the difficulties as a Japanese scholar of English and by narrating it as a dramatic monologue in the voice of Soseki. The poem Soseki was first published in the Times Literary Supplement, 6th of April 1984, in no time translated into Japanese by Yasunari Takahashi and published in the magazine Subaru Players, June 1984, and was subsequently collected in Poems 1953-1983, Letter from Tokyo 1987, Poems 1953 to 1988, published in 1989, Collected Poems 2007, and so on.
I have no idea what he's talking about. Well, I know Soseki was in London, but
As I said, I've never heard Thwaite recite this poem, but it means a lot to the Japanese reader as it deals with Natsume Soseki, who is by common consent one of the great or even greatest writers in modern Japanese literature, along with his contemporary Moriogai and later writers such as Tanizaki, Kawabata, Mishima, and Oe. He is great by virtue of the width of his intellectual scope, the sincerity of his moral consciousness, and the authenticity of his art of writing. He's an archetype of the Japanese intellectuals who tackled seriously the problem of Japan's modernization and confrontation with Western culture since 1868. The poem concerns the period of 2 years that Soseki spent in London, struggling to find out how to establish, as a Japanese scholar, a theoretically convincing system of English studies. As was still common with intellectual disciplines in the early Meiji era, Soseki had been given rigorous training in Chinese classics before he converted to intensive study of English and decided to specialize in English studies at the Imperial University. The period during which Soseki studied and then taught English language and literature can be divided into several stages: school, college, Imperial University, teaching at Fifth National College in Kumamoto, 2 years studying in London, and lectureship at the Imperial University. In Soseki's English education, as in other disciplines at the time, a large part was played by the Western lecturers or employed foreigners. To mention just a few, James Murdoch, who later went out to Australia and became the founding father of Japanese studies out there, taught English to Soseki while he was a student at the First National College. At Tohoku University Library, where precious Soseki materials are stored, I once had the memorable research experience of reading Soseki's handsome handwriting in English, corrected by Murdoch. At the Imperial University, Soseki was taught by James Main Dixon. Murdoch and Dixon both came from Scotland as those who did to found the engineering school of the Imperial University. The poem Soseki, London, December 1901, focuses on the 2 years he spent in London. However, it doesn't present Soseki as a heroic figure, but as a lonely scholar, heavily burdened with his task of English studies and lost in the middle of the English metropolis. The poem depicts the dark night of Soseki's soul, which was terribly neurotic, if not psychotic, and was on the brink of breakdown. How did things come to this? Before reading the poem, it would be appropriate to trace its background. After years of study and research at the Imperial University, Soseki was appointed to teach at Fifth National College in Kumamoto. His predecessor was Lafcadio Hearn, who proceeded then to take the lectureship at the Imperial University. There again, in 1904, Soseki was to replace Hearn as a result of the change of the Japanese government's policy of hiring Japanese members of staff instead of foreign lecturers. While in Kumamoto, Soseki was ordered by the Ministry of Education to study for 2 years on the government grant in the UK. On his arrival, he went to visit the Reverend Charles Freer Andrews, fellow and chaplain on Pembroke College, Cambridge, later supporter of Gandhi. A letter of reference from Mrs. Knott, an Anglican missionary in Kumamoto, hoping, if possible, to stay and study in Cambridge. But the Cambridge colleges were mainly meant for younger men and not for the 33-year-old Soseki. Besides, surprisingly, English studies as an independent discipline was not to come into being till 1917, a year after Soseki's death, although it existed, as Soseki knew well enough, in London, UCL, Edinburgh, and Dublin. Settling down in London, he attended Professor W.P. Carr's lectures at UCL for 1 term. Through Professor Carr's arrangement, Soseki received supervisions by the Shakespearean William James Craig at his Baker Street lodgings, which lasted from the beginning of the summer of 1901 from the beginning of 1901 to the summer of 1901, and was the only academic contact he had personally. Soseki later recalled his London days as the most unpleasant 2 years in my life. A qualified, well-educated scholar and prolific future writer, he had 2 years of disorientation, maladjustment, and self-chosen seclusion, absorbed in formulating series of literature out of the vast amount of collected materials. By the visitors from Japan, word was spread home that Soseki had gone mad. He himself wrote down in his diary and also wrote to his wife about his neurotic state of mind. One may say that heavily burdened with his task of English studies in an alien environment, he was undergoing an identity crisis and disintegration of personality. The poem Soseki adroitly incorporates some of these facts based on Soseki's diaries and letters with a variety of poetic techniques and devices. In the poem Soseki, London, December 1901, Thwaite delves into the interior of Soseki's mind and represents his mental crisis on his behalf by the method of internal or dramatic monologue, the method Thwaite had established in his masterly Victorian voices. A lost dog slinking in through a pack of wolves. In the opening line is echoed from Soseki's phrase in the preface to his series of literature, with the addition of the slinking as an epithet. The sense of humiliation is emphasized. A street of London with smells of cooking is characteristically covered by fog. The description might remind some readers of the evening scenery in T.S. Eliot's A Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. The yellow fog that rubbed its back upon the window panes, the yellow smoke that rubs its muzzle on the window panes. This is followed by 3 short lines, supposedly a haiku poem, in which Soseki excelled, containing the image of fallen leaves and London falling, evoking association with a famous nursery rhyme. These descriptions of external scenery abruptly turns to Soseki's resolution and sense of mission to establish literary theories. It turns again, as abruptly, to an external description of the moonlight cast on the river. Thus, the external and the internal are inseparably juxtaposed in the stream of consciousness of Soseki as a speaker of the monologue. In the next paragraph, it turns out that the moonlight on the river was a hallucination. Recognizing that, Soseki cries in the dark, far, far beyond the heavens, the forms of departing clouds, as a refrain draws a contrast between what moves above freely and the Soseki confined and constrained below, widely apart. The plotting and scheming sisters downstairs are Soseki's landladies, who he imagines are mocking at him by laying the copper penny which the day before he had given a beggar in town, a paranoiac fantasy on his part, which is later to be recorded in Mrs. Natsume's recollections of Soseki. Someone sent a telegram home, Natsume's gone mad. It yet remains to verify whether it was a philologist Okakura Yoshisaburo, the younger brother of the famous Okakura Kakuzo, or better known as Tenshin. In the poem, Soseki's paranoiac imagination makes him think so, think so, and feel lonely as he has no friend. Soseki was able to know London street by street with the help of Baedeker. Cambridge, where he visited the Reverend Andrews, was alien. So would Oxford be. What about going to study at Edinburgh? Out of his prejudice against the dialect, he rejects it. Thus he settles down in London, where I measure out meters as I walk, which might echo Eliot's I have measured out my life with coffee spoons, once again from Prufrock. In the next few lines may be detected Soseki's awareness of racial discrimination at the beginning of the century. The episodes in the poem are all based on Soseki's diaries and notes. After the refrain, far, far beyond the clouds, Soseki repeats his resolution to establish literary theories. Midnight, a mouse squeaks, contained in the haiku-like 3 lines, may remind us of the mouse in the wasteland, but it eventually identifies with Soseki himself as a frightened mouse in a cell facing north, typical of a neurotic state of mind. His purpose, resolution, and daily actions become faint and disorderly in his confused consciousness. He vividly remembers his supervision with Craig, but there is a contrast and discrepancy between his intellectual exchange with Craig and the reality of his mean and debased daily life. By the old castle at Komoro, the clouds are whitened, the wanderer grieves, is a direct quotation of the lines in Shimazaki Tosun's famous poem, including the Penguin Book of Japanese Verse, edited bonus weight. There is difference between the pastoral countryside of Tosun's lyric poem and the urban metropolis of the Soseki poem. But common to the characters in both poems is that they are equally lonely and sorrowful travelers or wanderers. The lines beginning with impenetrable people, just on the slide, are taken verbatim from the translation by Masao Miyoshi of Soseki's fragment in his Accomplices of Silence, quoted in my dated book on modern Japanese literature. Brett is Soseki's landlord, and his recommendation of intermarriage is mentioned in Soseki's diary. Tears welling up in a strange land is again a quotation from Tosun's poem, Coconut, also in the Penguin Book of Japanese Verse, referring to a coconut floating over to the shore of a far country, an image suitable to Soseki. In the last line of the poem, Soseki creeps into bed, scared by wolves, as referred to in the opening line of the poem. Towards the end of Soseki, London, December 1901, the protagonist narrator, Soseki, feels he is in Ultima Thule, the farthest end of the world. Soseki was in London from the age of 33 to 35, midway in the journey of his life, as Dante was at the beginning of Inferno. This Ultima Thule for Soseki then was equivalent to Inferno or Purgatorio. Whether he would reach Paradiso is another matter. Earlier in the poem, we have detected echoes from Proof Rock and the Wasteland. Eliot was to write in the Wasteland about the spiritual desolation and dereliction of his own, as well as of the times. If we may expand the Eliotian link of association, the Ultima Thule could be Soseki's Wasteland. Throughout Eliot's The Wasteland, blind prophet Tiresias is not only a character transforming himself into all the other characters in the poem, but also the narrator giving coherence and unity to the poem, which could otherwise be disorganized and fragmentary. In Thwaites' Soseki, London, December 1901, it is Soseki's stream of consciousness put in the internal dramatic monologue that gives coherence and unity to the poem, which could otherwise be disorganized and fragmentary as the representation of a sick soul. The wasteland contains a number of quotations and allusions contributing to the multi-layered meanings of the poem. Soseki, London, December 1901, contains a number of quotations from Soseki's own diaries, letters, fragments, etc., and also makes effective use of haiku-like lines and quotations from Shimazaki Toson as refrains representing Soseki's stream of consciousness at particular moments. Soseki doesn't belong to English culture, which is out there as the object of his study. Anthony Thwaite, who belongs to it, projects himself into Soseki, empathizes with him, and reenacts his agonies. Like Eliot's The Wasteland, Thwaites' Soseki, London, December 1901, is a universal representation of mental wasteland beyond time and place. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
That was just wonderful. What a deep dive into that poem. I'm going to completely have to reread I Am a Cat from a different point of view. Should we stop there? It's 8 o'clock.
Well, thank you very much, Hisaaki-sensei.
Okay, all right, so we're back now. Oh my goodness. There was a great deal more to his slides about his work and his poetry and his anthologies, but that will all be available later. But I really appreciate this deep, deep dive into understanding that poem. I couldn't have done it without you. Thank you so very much. All right, let's see here. I haven't had a chance to look at the slide. There's just a very short. Well, Charles DeWolf does ask a question. He asks, did Soseki arrive in the UK before or after the death of Queen Victoria? I vaguely remember something about that. Was it perhaps the coronation of Edward VII that Soseki describes?
Thank you
What
for
do you think?
asking that, Charles. Soseki arrived in London at the end of October 1900, and Queen Victoria died soon after the New Year. And Soseki, in fact, went to watch the funeral procession in town and in Hyde Park on the shoulders of the landlord of his lady, because landlord of his lodgings, because Soseki was rather short. And there's a humorous description of the scene, a crowd of people hanging from the trees as if they were fruits. That's Soseki's expression in the diary. So he went to the funeral procession, but because of the illness of King Edward VII, the coronation was a little bit postponed till summer, I suppose. This time Soseki didn't go and see it.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. I'd just like, that's the only question. So if people wish to unmute and perhaps just have a few minutes of a general discussion or any thoughts you had about this.
Could I ask a question? I just wondered whether the haiku represented in the poem were really Soseki's haiku or not.
Actually, not.
Not, okay.
It's Thwaite's invention.
Okay.
I wonder whether I should say haiku-like lines or
Like, yes, I know.
Thwaite meant them to be haiku. So
Right.
it's a delicate question. But on the other hand, quotation from Soseki, excuse me, from Toson is really, they are
Genuine.
Toson's own lines.
Did he know Shimoseki Toson?
I think they were in different camps, probably. Toson was, he started as a Japanese romantic poet earlier, but later came in good terms with Tayama Katai and those realists, naturalists, novelists, and Soseki was slightly, as far as I understand it, detached from any groups or literary writers, although he had his own group of disciples, including Akutagawa, but he was rather detached from what was called bundan. That's what I understand.
Thank you.
Best thing for a writer to be.
Can I ask a quick question? It's a wonderfully English in American or British, or obviously T.S. Eliot influenced their wonderfully English poem with those delightful haiku interludes as well. I wonder, has it been translated into Japanese? How well is it known in Japan? Is Thwaite's work known here?
Yes, which year was it? 18 or 19. Between my wife and me, we produced a bilingual edition. I went to visit the Thwaites at Mill House in Norfolk at the end of July 2015. And on that occasion, we talked about whether it would be feasible to produce a Japanese edition, bilingual edition of his poems. And he was very willing and chose 50 poems.
Oh.
And, on the basis of that, we have produced this volume, which is also on one of the slides. And
Which volume is that?
I
toward
remember,
the end, I think I should have
Coming
noted
out?
the
Yeah.
number.
Could you put it in the chat? Just write the title, and it's hard to see on the screen.
Oh, okay.
I remember Hisaaki Sensei giving with Leiko, his wife. They gave a lecture at Meiji University, I think it was, and
James House, yes.
and you recited the poems in Japanese very well.
So what's the title of the book? Is that the question?
In Japanese, Anthony Thwaite 大役詩選集 selected bilingual selected poems of Anthony Thwaite by Reiko and Hisaaki Yamanouchi. I put it in the slide bibliography.
Oh, okay, okay.
And recently, an American edition of selection of Anthony's poems was published by Baylor University, Waco, Texas, edited by Kevin Gardner. And he kindly mentions and includes our bilingual translation in his book, in his bibliography.
Are there any other poems in the Victorian Voices book that refer to Soseki? I don't remember.
None, I mean, all British people and none other than British, I understand. I should have, I should have brought the volume, but it's somewhere.
Not sure I found it. Selected letters of Philip Larkin? Not sure.
I wonder what he thought about. I mean, there was quite a lot of controversy about Philip Larkin's letters when they were published. Did he have any? Did Thwaite have any opinion about that you recall?
I've never talked about it with him, and he is a gentle, friendly person, and in such a situation, I think he tends to be reconciled rather than fight. And Kingsley Amis and his son were involved in that, I remember. And they were critical, very critical of Anthony's way of editing the letters. And I do not know what the co-editor, Andrew Motion, thought about this row.
Well, the row was about Larkin, of course, not about Thwaite, but I mean, it showed another side of Larkin that people were not familiar with. Anyway, thank you.
Yes, Charles.
I have a question about Anthony Thwaite's editorship of Encounter, which I used to read. And he seems to have worn many hats. He was a poet and a man very interested in other cultures, but Encounter was also political. It was founded by anti-Stalinists. And by the time I started reading it, it was fairly conservative. I mean, do you know anything about that?
It was subsidized by the
CIA.
But they did. I don't think Anthony Thwaite would have known about that until it came out much later.
Oh, thank you, Tim.
Both Spender and Thwaite were ignorant of the fact, and he withdrew very quickly as soon as it was certified.
I was afraid to ask the question, and now I'm glad I did.
I think Anthony joined it for the sake of Spender, on whom he was on good terms with, perhaps. Otherwise, he would not have joined it. Before that, he had been the literary editor of New Statesman, and he would have been happier to stay there.
His translations of Japanese poetry were collaborative, I think, with a
Jeffrey Bonus, yes.
But did Thwaite himself know much Japanese at all, or?
Bonus
It was a
feel
scholar.
better. And Anthony's function was to polish it as
Right.
poetry. I understood it that way.
I see. Okay, thank you.
I must say that I do like the bonus Thwaite translations. They're often better than many of the other ones I've seen. At least they work as poetry in English, which I think is a translation should.
Anthony would be happy to hear you say that.
But I met Anthony in Tokyo, and he was very kind. And I introduced him to Alan Booth, so we had a bit of a drinking session with Alan Booth, which was always a rather wild affair. And but after Alan died, I sort of edited his second book, Looking for the Lost. And Kodansha at that time was sort of giving up all English books. And so it was published by Kodansha America. And Kodansha didn't send any review copies anywhere. And so I finally got on to Anthony Thwaite and said, would you like to look at this book and Looking for the Lost and see if you could review it somewhere? So he very kindly reviewed it in the Times Literary Supplement. And he was a very, very kind and good man, I think. And I also sent him the anthology, the sort of anthology of Alan Booth's journalism. And he said, well, I don't want to review it. So I said, no, I'm not asking you to review it. He was then rather old and ill. And I said, but I just want to give it you because you were so kind before. So I think he died not long after that. So I have very good memories of Anthony and his kindness.
Yamanouchi Sensei, thank you very much. That was a very interesting talk, and it was great to hear you speak about Anthony's poetry. And I hadn't realized until tonight how really seriously concerned with archaeology he was. And that is a very interesting take on his poetry. And I thought your explanation of the sort of archaeology as a metaphor for poetry and poetry as a metaphor for archaeology was, I thought, really, very appropriate. And because I think that he's often seen as being, one of the archetypal movement poets. But I think that is to put him in too small a box, because he has a very wide range. I mean, inscriptions and new confessions. These are, I think, quite extraordinary non-movement type of writing.
Yeah.
That, as you point out, the dramatic monologue, extremely well done dramatic monologue, but really wide-ranging, and very different from Larkin, who when as I recall, when Anthony said to him, "Wouldn't you like to go to Japan?" He said, "Only if I could come back in a day."
It was China, actually.
Was it China? I'm sorry. Okay. But it's the range that Anthony showed, I thought, was very considerable. And he's not often recognized for that. He's remembered more for things like Mr. Cooper, which is a very movement type poem. So it's nice that you emphasized that range, because I think he's of that era. Well, he's a very remarkable writer. So thank you very much for that. It was a very interesting talk.
Well, thank you very much for your expert professional comment. Thank you for
professional. Moi.
Okay, yeah, I'd say I certainly learned a lot here. Anything else, anyone? No? Okay.
one of my favorite poems of Anthony's is the one about the dead mole he finds in a churchyard, lying on the ground, and having his grave in the air. And
I'll have to look that up.
it's a really good poem.
Okay. All right. Well, so Yamanouchi Sensei, thank you so much for putting in all the work you did. I mean, for this audience, it was just like flowers. Thank you so much. Everybody good?
It was very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Indeed.
very much indeed.
All right.
Yes, thank you.
All right.
Thank you
Thank
very
you
much.
very, very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Indeed. Okay, everybody, have a wonderful night, and look for a lot of information in the report coming out soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you very
Good
much.
night, everybody.
All right.
Thank you. I couldn't comment because it's subject I don't understand at all, but I learned a lot. Thank you.
Fair enough.
So I was quiet today.
Okay. All right.
I met Anthony and Anne at Tokyo Women's Christian Universities. I was so thrilled to listen to your presentation. Thank you very much.
Oh, that's lovely to hear.
Bye.
All right. I think I'll
Oh.
stop the recording.
Mm.
Have a good
Bye,
night.
everybody.
Thank you
Yeah,
once again.
Peggy, can I call you?